I hope you grabbed your cup of coffee and have some time to talk about software development and other Java topics. Today I have a special guest, Jens Schauder, software developer at the Spring Data team, and they're working on Spring Data JPA and Spring Data JDBC. Hi Jens, how are you?
Doing good, at least as good as possible with the current situation.
Yeah.
I mean, since I'm working from home all day anyway, the change isn't that big, except the kids are at home, but they're big enough to take care of themselves, so everything is fine.
Yeah, well, it's basically the same for me, but they somehow feel it's different than it was before. I mean, more distractions, and as you said, kids are staying at home, no school and everything. That really changed the overall situation, at least for me.
Yeah, that's true. I need to stay away from Twitter and news sites and similar stuff.
Oh yeah, that really helps right now. Yes, I introduced you as a developer who works on Spring Data JPA and Spring Data JDBC. And yesterday we had an interesting question about that. Someone asked, what's the difference between these two projects and when should you use which one? Maybe you want to say something about that? I'm pretty sure you have a clear opinion on that.
Yes, I do, obviously. To clarify my bias, Spring Data JPA is a project that I used before I joined Pivotal myself, and now I'm basically the main maintainer with the help of the rest of the Spring Data team of Spring Data JPA. And Spring Data JDBC is what I started when I joined Pivotal. So built on the basic infrastructure of Spring Data, it's my baby. So if you ask me what should you use, it's obviously Spring Data JDBC.
Of course.
On a more serious side, Spring Data JPA or JPA in general has one big benefit. It's very well known. It's I'm not sure, but it's many years old, which also means all the obvious bugs have been found, lots of features have been added, and therefore it's certainly a solid foundation, and many people know it.
Yeah.
But I think JPA has some serious design problems, if not to say design mistakes. That's a little unfair to say because I certainly wouldn't have been able to come up with JPA in the first place. But when I started with JDBC, or Spring Data JDBC, my task was create something without JPA. It should be simpler and easier to use. And also I have to maintain it again in parallel with Spring Data JPA. And this led me to a point where I realized what are the points that make JPA really extremely complex. I mean, if you start with JPA, you get some kind of tutorial, maybe on your site or somewhere else. And the first tutorial looks always really, really easy. You create an entity, you save it, you load it, everything works out of the box, no problem whatsoever. But if you do a serious project with Spring Data JPA or JPA on its own, you sooner or later learn about lazy loading exceptions, about first and second level cache and their interactions. And I think the main problem really is JPA tries to more or less map an almost arbitrary object graph to an arbitrary database schema.
Yeah.
Therefore, it has to have a lot of flexibility, and Spring Data JDBC is much more constrained in that sense. And it also takes inspiration from domain-driven design and basically breaks down any object graph into aggregates, which are small clusters of objects. Typically, 1 to maybe 3 or 4 classes, I think, is a typical size for an aggregate. And such an aggregate gets persisted as one thing and loaded as one thing. And this makes a lot of things for the developer of the object relational mapper, which is me, much, much easier, because it turns out you certain kind of relationships you don't need to map. And but it also has a benefit for the user, because I think Spring Data JDBC is much, much easier to understand than JPA.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that.
Which, again,
I definitely agree on that. So it's much easier to understand. You're limited in the feature set compared to JPA. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, there are dozens of features in the JPA spec and additional proprietary Hibernate features, which you should basically never use in a project because it either makes your domain model incredibly complex or, which happens relatively often, it slows it down because it adds complexity and in too many steps when you try to persist that on the database. Yeah. So I haven't used Spring Data JDBC in a real project so far. I played around with it. I had created a few smaller projects, but so far I didn't have a project that went live with Spring Data JDBC. But based on the stuff that I saw so far, I like the approach. It's different, especially this focus on the aggregate. But if you want to follow domain-driven design, then that's really tough with JPA. There are a few things that just don't match the domain-driven design concepts. And that is much easier with Spring Data JDBC. And of course, you have to accept other things if you want to get these benefits. But that's what we always have with a framework, right? I mean, there's no tool that's perfect for everything.
And there's like one point of confusion in JPA that many people trip over, which is basically the behavior of the first level cache.
Oh, yeah.
If you call save or persist on the entity manager, JPA actually does very little. It basically just marks the entity for persisting, but it doesn't necessarily access the database, and might do that on a totally different time. And the same is true for load a class, and it might just create a proxy with an ID in it and actually loads it once you access it, which I guess led to surprises for every JPA developer who has some serious experience with it. And these kinds of things are much, much more straightforward with Spring Data JDBC.
Yeah.
If you call save, it does a bunch of SQL statements, and then your aggregate is either saved in the database or you got an exception. You don't get an exception like half an hour later when you trigger a flush by some different event.
Yeah. Yeah, this first level cache gets even more confusing if you try to load an entity again within the same session, where it looks like Hibernate did everything, or all other JPA implementation as well, did everything that you need, including the SQS statement. While you're never working with the data that you got back from the database, you're still working with the same object that you fetched at the beginning of your session, which might be a completely different one. So yeah, these are a lot of hidden pitfalls in JPA, and I like the approach of Spring Data JDBC, that it's more straightforward and that I'm more in control. But if at the same time you also recognize, okay, here are the hidden benefits of Hibernate, Eclipse Link, that do a lot of things for us, sure, and where we or at least where I sometimes think, okay, this is actually nice if every developer would understand it, which is a high risk when introducing JPA into a project. You always have different skill levels within a team, and some framework that hides as much as all the JPA implementation does. There's a high risk that someone isn't aware of something, that they trip over these things, which I would expect isn't as bad with Spring Data JDBC because it's just a more direct interaction with the database, I would say.
Yes, exactly.
So maybe for everyone who hasn't used Spring Data JDBC, can you point out the 3 to 5 main differences to JPA and make it really clear, okay, instead of what you normally would do with JPA like this, behaves in Spring Data JDBC like that. So really a few key points.
Yeah, sure. The first thing to understand is the role of an aggregate and an aggregate root. As I said, an aggregate is a cluster of classes, and it has basically a handle, which is the aggregate root, which is one of the entities, and typically the entity that has the same name as you would give to the complete aggregate. The canonical example is a purchase order, where you have an entity called purchase order, which would be the aggregate root, and then you probably also have order items in there as well, which together make up the aggregate. And Spring Data JDBC loads and saves always a complete aggregate. So if you load an order or a purchase order, you always will load the order items with it. From that comes possibly even more important difference is if you want to reference a different aggregate, you do that by ID, not by Java reference. So let's say in the order item, you kind of have products, but the products can exist without the order. So they are not part of the aggregate, but products would be their own aggregate. And therefore, you would have in the order item not an actual product reference, but a product ID. And then you have to take care yourself to actually load the product when you actually need it.
Which is basically a good idea if you want to build a system of microservices at some point, and maybe start with a monolith or just with, well, your first try of cutting your services, right? I mean, that's basically what we would want to have there.
I'm strongly convinced that this kind of modularity is beneficial for every application because it breaks your application into chunks that you can handle and think about. And it makes things independent of each other. The important part, which is kind of plays in the question that was asked in the chat, does using JDBC or JPA impact your DB schema? No, it doesn't. In the object model, we have IDs instead of references, but on the database, we have only IDs anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. There are a couple of differences in features that Spring Data JDBC eventually will get that it doesn't have yet, like composite IDs don't exist yet. So if you have these in your model, you will have to change that if you want to use Spring Data JDBC.
Yeah, but in general, it doesn't really affect the database schema, as it should be with each as it should be for each and every mapping framework that you use in the Java world. Databases use relational table models, and these are highly optimized, and there are clear routes how to define them to keep them efficient and everything. And yeah, as I said, the framework that then works based on these tables is and should be independent of the, or shouldn't affect the database tables that your DBA or yourself designed in the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Kuram asked also a second question, from Spring Data evolution perspective, how does JDBC versus JPA compare?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What is the evolution perspective?
So I expect that he wants to know if JDBC, Spring Data JDBC is basically the next step after Spring Data JPA.
Well, they are two very well. They both work on relational databases, but they are very very different in the way how they work internally. Also in the way or who is responsible for mapping the types. With the JPA, Spring Data JPA is just a thin wrapper above it, and all the type mapping is actually done in your JPA implementation. With JDBC, it's actually done in Spring Data JDBC. And I won't publish any download numbers because I don't even have them available right now. But while I'm proud over the growth of Spring Data JDBC, it's still like in the single digit, probably in the low single digit percentage of Spring Data JPA. So it would be a little even arrogant for my standards to claim Spring Data JDBC is the next step up after JPA. Although on a conceptual perspective, I actually do think that. I think Spring Data JDBC is the one conceptually cleaner. I mean, I benefited from like 1 decade of Hibernate and JPA experience.
Which also is the reason why the Spring Data JPA download numbers are that high. I mean, that's just
exactly
an established framework that has been used for ages. Okay, so Daruga Yi asked if Reactive Hibernate is coming. So I'm not part of the Hibernate team, but I've heard that there are ideas and plans to work on a Reactive Hibernate version. But they are, as far as I've heard, in a pretty early stage still. I mean, the main issue there is before you can think about a Reactive Hibernate version, you have to have a good reactive specification or at least library to access a relational databases. R2DBC might be the solution for that, but you definitely need an alternative to JDBC because JDBC is blocking. And then it doesn't make any sense to put a reactive library on top of JDBC. I mean, you can't build anything reactive on top of something that's blocking. So
and I'm actually not sure if Hibernate is. I think they or like the new variant they are building for Hibernate. They call it reactive, but as far as I understand it, I only looked into it really, really quickly. It seems more to be asynchronous, but not reactive. So, to my understanding, there's no back pressure there, which is an important part of the whole reactive idea. But yes, stuff is growing there. Will probably take some time until it's production ready. And as a contender from the Spring side, there's Spring Data R2DBC, which is reactive and which also Spring Data R2DBC and Spring Data JDBC are the common parent module, and we try to move them along together so that we benefit each other from new features, bug fixes, and so on. So there's at least a reactive object relational mapper available right now.
Yeah, that's definitely something you could know. Was it Daruga? You could take a look at if you want to dive deeper on that. And regarding the example of Spring Data JDBC, Jens, maybe you can post a link into the video comments after we close this stream with further information. I'm sure you have some documentation available somewhere.
I'll post a couple of links afterwards.
Yeah.
Currently, I locked myself out of YouTube. In the beginning, I mentioned that For my own sanity, I have to block myself from Twitter and news streams, and I use an app for that, and I can't break that. And I set it like 10 hours, so I currently can't access YouTube, but that will change in a couple of hours, a few hours, and then I add a couple of links,
Yeah, or you can
including
see.
to an Spring Data JDBC example. I don't think it's fair to um, torture anybody with my live coding skills. That I leave that to Josh Long.
And he's definitely a hard competition if you want to provide a better presentation than he does.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Okay, Wanderer 2097 asked thoughts on Panache ORM of Quarkus and what improvements would you like to see in next JPA spec? Yeah, I think Panache is a great idea. It does a lot of things that you also get with Spring Data JPA. To be honest, I always ask myself why we need a framework like Spring on top of JPA to provide these features that everyone basically uses and needs. But right, the Spring team was happy to fill that gap for quite a while, and it looks like that now with Panache we get something similar on Quarkus. Yeah.
I think that's very understandable from a historic perspective. I mean, first there was like in the early 2000s, everybody was building his or her own object relational mapper, and there were like dozens available. It was like nowadays picking a web framework. Back in the day, picking an object relational mapper or write your own one. And until Hibernate basically occupied that spot and everybody else basically disappeared.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think it's from Ruby where they have this introduced the idea of generating queries based on method names, and Oliver took that and put that into Java, and that's basically at least one part of the creation method of Spring Data. The one thing about how do you pronounce that? Panache? Panache? I don't know.
Panache, I have no clue.
I think currently they don't support the references at all. Is that true?
I'm not sure.
I think they only have single entities, which is similar currently to R2DBC or Spring Data R2DBC.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's still in a pretty early stage, right? So sure, Spring Data JPA can do a little bit more. I think it's going into the right direction.
Yeah.
These are features that you either, well, until now you either got them from Spring Data JPA or you implemented all these stuff yourself. And that was a pretty repetitive task. I mean, it's not complex or something you can't do, but Spring Data JPA and now Panache make these things definitely a lot easier. What's the best source to learn Hibernate? Well, I can't resist. I need to plug my own site. So, of course, the tutorials that you find on thoughtsonjava.org and on this YouTube channel, or give this book a try, Hibernate Tips. Besides that, the Hibernate documentation is quite good. Stack Overflow is always a good source. If you are running into problems, just make sure to double check the answers that you get there, especially if you're looking at older posts. There are quite a bunch of posts that answers that provide bad advice that might seem to fix the issue on your development machine, but will cause severe issues in production. So, for example, you still find answers that suggest to use eager loading to fetch lazy initialization exceptions, which of course fetches the exception, fixes the exception, but then slows down your application in production to a level where it might not be usable at all.
Yeah. Since you plug your stuff, I plug my own as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe not for learning Hibernate, but maybe for avoiding, or at least be warned about the pitfalls. There's a talk by myself out there. I think it's called 1 to 100, from 0 to 100 with Spring Data JPA.
Oh yeah.
Where I point out some of the common misconceptions and potential pitfalls of JPA that I think every JPA developer, and especially beginning JPA developers, should be aware about.
Yeah, maybe you can provide a link to that. It's on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thoughts on auditing and Envers in particular. People think I'm crazy that I still prefer database triggers, but Envers feels like an incomplete solution to me. Well, that's not completely wrong. Envers only writes audit records when you perform changes on entities. So all of that is based on lifecycle events of your entities. And if you execute a plain SQL update statement, or if you have other processes that update the database, or if you have a DBA that logs in and changes something, then all these things are not tracked by Envers. So that's definitely a downside. If you can live with that, I think Envers is okay. I mean, in most cases, it gets the job done. It provides an API to look at your audit log either in vertical slices or in horizontal slices, which is quite interesting for use cases like seeing all the changes performed on one record, or going back in time and double check what was the what were the information stored in that account on the first of the month or something.
I think a problem with Envers, or probably every generic solution, is that it has no semantic information whatsoever. It only operates on database rows.
Yeah.
And in at least in many cases that I have seen, people use Envers, but really should have basically modeled some kind of domain events and logged those away specifically. And they try to recreate that from Envers, and that's going to be painful.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of information that might be hiding in there implicitly, but really isn't very obvious.
Yeah.
Like, why did this row change? Was it very often you have a real business process, like an order was sent, and therefore the status changed or something. And in many cases, it's a better idea to, in my experience, to explicitly model that and persist that separately with whatever tool you like for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree. A solution with Envers that I've seen in project is teams decided to extend the Hibernate Envers revision entity and then add additional information to that. So I have an example for that on the blog in which I show how to add user information to the revision entity to answer who performed the change. And I saw it in several projects that teams also decided to put additional information into it, like the REST endpoint on the API level that was called, or name of a batch job that performed the change, or other high-level information. But yeah, it's still not as easy and straightforward as a domain event would be. So for these cases, I also would prefer to roll your own solution for that and store the information somewhere else.
We actually skipped the second part of the question a little further up about wishes for the JPA specification.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually Probably my wishes are very different from most other people's because I don't use JPA to persist my data. I use JPA to implement Spring Data JPA against. And therefore, what I quite often see is that the different implementations behave differently. And the maintainers of both projects basically claim, well, it's not in the specification, so I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if it makes sense or not. So what I really would love to see is a more activity that like issues getting closed, and what would really, I mean, not just closed like we don't care, but closed with a real solution. Um, and what would really help with that would be if the TCK would get moved to something that one can work with without spending a full day just for setting it up.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Something based on JUnit where I can, because I really would love to like, hey, you have this kind of undefined behavior in the specification, and some implementations work like this, others work like this. Just put one of these tests into your TCK and be done with it. Unfortunately, I'm not really seeing that this is happening in the near future. I'm
Yeah.
actually quite skeptical about the progress of JPA and Jakarta EE in general. I'm not too happy what's going on there.
Yeah, I didn't look too close into the other Jakarta E specifications, but as it seems for JPA, most people are relatively happy with the current situation of the specification. It does most of the things, um, especially if you look from a user perspective. So there, the motivation doesn't seem to be too high to put a lot of effort into it. But I totally agree with you. There are several parts of the specification that seem to be clearly defined when you read them for the first time, and then you look at Eclipse Link and Hibernate as the most popular implementations. They interpreted the specification differently and implemented it differently. And unfortunately, sometimes there either is no test or both implementations passed the test, and both teams have good reasons and can explain why they implemented it in different ways. And that is just not what was initially intended with these specifications. I mean, you would expect that there's one clear way how a feature should work, and there are several points in the spec where someone probably would need to take a second look at and then maybe just pick one version of it and say, okay, this is how it should work. Because otherwise, while applications based on JPA or Spring Data JPA running into the same issues, these applications are not really portable from one implementation to the other. I mean, you can do that with a relatively low amount of work, but there are several things that will break horribly if you replace Hibernate with Eclipse Link or the other way around.
Yeah. Also, what goes in the same direction is I see that Hibernate does a lot of stuff. Sorry, I can't like name a single thing, but I've seen a couple of things Hibernate is doing. Like they are adding features, and I don't see any plan, any progress of getting that moved into JPA. And if everybody's using Hibernate and the Hibernate specific features, JPA starts becoming well, kind of useless if you don't like if you use JPA but not only JPA, you're losing the at least theoretical chance to move from one implementation to another, which is basically the main purpose of JPA,
Yeah,
at least to my understanding.
yeah. Yeah, and we're also missing out on another advantage of the specification separate from the implementation approach. And normally you would have multiple implementations, managed by different teams that develop independently of each other, both of them driving innovation and introducing new features. And I don't see that right now. That seems to happen on the Hibernate side, not so much in Eclipse Link. And yeah, that is one of the reasons, I think, why Hibernate becomes the de facto standard for JPA. So yeah, let's take another look at the chat. Make sure that we don't miss too many questions. RabbitMQ Spring Cloud Data Flow. Ayush, can you provide a few more information? There's another post. How to make a real-time with Java. Give some ideas. Have used RabbitMQ, Spring WebSocket. What should I use?
Well, if real-time refers to what I think real-time refers to, basically an application where you can guarantee that certain steps occur within a well-defined time, I think you should pick a different language. That's just not what Java is built for.
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure if there was. It's really not what Java is intended for, I think. But I never done real-time computing, so I know there are people doing really crazy stuff with the JVM. Many years ago, I heard a talk about someone writing applications for high volume trading, where you like a delay in microseconds can be measured in $10,000s loss. They do fun stuff like completely disabling the garbage collector and basically creating all the objects they need and never let the garbage collector run. But that's highly specific what they're doing, and way beyond what I know, and certainly way beyond what can be explained in half an hour in a chat, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never used or never did anything that required real-time processing. I've heard that there are real-time versions of the JVM, but I have never really searched for it or gave it a try. I have no clue. So yeah, sorry, but the two of us are probably the wrong persons to answer that question. Ochko asks, table per class versus mapped superclass, when to pick one over another. Yeah. First of all, we probably need to explain the difference between table per class and mapped superclass. So both of them are basically two different variations of how to work with inheritance in your domain model. But the general idea is different. So with mapped superclass, you are basically sharing mapping definitions and nothing else. So sure, in your Java classes, you have an inheritance hierarchy. But the only thing that Hibernate does there is it shares the mapping information defined on the superclass with all the subclasses. So you can't do any polymorphic queries or polymorphic associations. That's different with table per class. There, you not only have your inheritance hierarchy on the Java level, but also in your mapping definition. That means that you can create a polymorphic query or association, which means you can have a publication, for example, with the subclasses book and blog post, and an author can have an association to publications. And if you access that association, then your persistence provider will fetch all blog posts and book implementations or records that are associated with that author, create the corresponding entity object for that, and return you one list that contains book and blog post entities. So yeah, when to pick one over another, that depends on the way you use this association. Or if you use the inheritance hierarchy, do you need polymorphic queries, and do you want to really use something like inheritance hierarchy in your mapping? Then you need to use table per class. If you just need the inheritance hierarchy on the Java level, and you just want to share mapping information, then a mapped superclass is more than good enough. What do you say, Jens? Anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. Except, I mean, there are other options beside table per class, right?
Yeah, you can use joint or single table.
Single table. And I'd say what to use. I'm not sure there's a real use case for joint. Maybe if like really lots of columns in some of the entities that you don't want to drag around in others.
Yeah, the main benefit of joint compared to table per class would be that polymorphic queries are more efficient. But if you're using table per class, then Hibernate would generate a query using a union clause in the from clause of your query, which is pretty complex. And with table per class, you could do a simple join on the table that maps the superclass. But you would also have additional joins for each and every subclass in that hierarchy, which can be a different issue. I mean, you then always have a bunch of joins, and then it depends on the complexity of the query and the overall amount of data, if that becomes an issue or not. Yeah, from a performance point of view, single table is most often the better approach because the queries are extremely simple. Is transactional isolation serializable used in practice? Will this work if I have two server instances trying to execute a transaction at the same time? Have you seen it in any project? I think I haven't seen it.
I've seen sometimes issues popping up with isolation levels not behaving as people expect. One big problem with these is that they are not 100% defined. So what databases do depends on the actual database in use. So since these issues pop up, yes, people do use that. But the thing about an isolation level like serializable, I mean, the meaning is that it behaves as if one transaction runs after the other. It doesn't have to actually run them one after the other. They still might run in parallel, but the results you're seeing have to be such that you can't tell that from looking at your results. And this puts a lot of load on the server because he basically has to keep logs or copies of data and stuff around.
Yeah. Performance-wise, it's quite often a horrible idea.
Exactly. So I would try to avoid it, if not for any other reason, but that there are very few people that actually properly understand what these isolation level means. Oh dear. There was again. I can have to look if I find that article afterwards. A couple of months ago, I read an article about isolation levels and a similar concept, which I thought is like, it's basically the same thing. And the article very persuading argued that, well, almost everybody thinks it's the same thing, but it's actually not. So I would stay away from these. So my best practice would be, can you get around that? Can you do that with like modeling your schema in a different way so that you don't need that?
Yeah, if you have a DBA on your team, you
What
should ask
actually
that person as well.
what actually might help is thinking in aggregates, because aggregates again are units that are used together, and with Spring Data JDBC and optimistic locking, you are always guaranteed that a complete aggregate is saved in a consistent state, and only between aggregates you might have issues with consistency if you throw away your foreign keys, which you don't have to. But I would need way more detail to give a useful answer to that, I think.
Yeah.
So that.
Priyak asks if this is Hibernate and a data JPA collaboration. Well, I'm not associated with the Hibernate team, so due to that, no, it isn't. But it's just a chat between Jens and me.
Yeah, but really, I, as representative of Spring Data JPA, try to collaborate with Hibernate as well as possible, and normally it works pretty well. So I had quite some conversations with Vladimir Alkea, like discussing stuff, if a certain behavior is a bug or a different interpretation of the specification and stuff like that. So I think we mostly get along pretty well. Of course, sometimes we have these issues where one side said, "Hey, this is your bug," and the other side, "Nope, not your bug." But you always have that in these kind of situations.
Yeah, that happens everywhere. I mean, that happens between two teams within the same company. So
exactly.
yeah. No, but yeah, if anyone has an issue with Hibernate or questions there, you can always try to reach out to the Hibernate team, and in general, they are pretty open and approachable. Yeah, so Arto said, I would like to deploy my app to AWS. When the database is in production, is there a way to change the schema of database as easily as if I do when I test locally? Definitely not. Because
And that's a good thing.
yeah, what are best practices here? Well, that's a huge topic.
Well, towards flyway or liquid-based, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would like to keep it at that level for now. And then performing rolling updates and zero downtime database changes is something we might discuss on a different live stream with more time than we have right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, Flyway, Liquibase. These are the two main frameworks for that. Yeah, maybe we then take a quick look at the remaining questions, and then we can probably wrap this up. Can you give me a brief idea about Hibernate contextualization in a simpler language? I've gone through the JBoss doc and probably will pull off my hair if I do it the second time. I don't really understand the question.
I think he's referring to the session, the first level cache.
Okay,
Well,
right.
I try once. Otherwise, one of the videos I will link afterwards to has another try of myself at this thing. Basically, JPA promises you that when you load an entity with a given ID, as long as you're in the same session, which is, for most intents and purposes, equivalent to the same transaction, you will get the exact same instance. So not another object with the same value, but actually the same object. In order to achieve that, Hibernate or any JPA implementation has to keep the object around. And whenever you ask for an object with a given ID, it will give you that instance. That is on one hand necessary for Hibernate, because Hibernate does something called dirty tracking. Basically, if you load an entity with Hibernate and modify it, you don't have to call persist or save or anything. It still is attached to that entity, notices that you have changed it, and will persist it at the end of the transaction. It also has some unfortunate side effects, like a common scenario is that an entity gets changed, and for one reason or the other, you now want to compare it to its original version. But if you just ask the entity manager to give you that entity again, it will give you the exact same instance, the one that you already changed. So if you actually want to get the old one, you have to open a new entity manager or evict it from the entity manager before querying it. Yeah, I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah, I
explain
agree.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, Adam said that they moved from JPA to MyBartes because team always run entity relationships into messes. Yeah, sure. With sorry for that. With object relational mappers as powerful and as flexible as JPA or all JPA implementations are, you're always at the risk that you mess something up if you not exactly know what you're doing. But that's the case for all frameworks. And even if you use something that doesn't provide that many hidden features as Hibernate does, even if you do plain JDBC, you will find a way to mess up the project if you not really understand what you're doing there. So yeah, moving to MyBartest can of course solve that, but only if you then make sure that everyone knows what they are doing. Hachiko asks, is it possible to make a high-performance app with JPA only without using Hibernate-specific stuff? Sure. Take a look at the videos here on my channel or on the performance-related articles on my blog. I would say about 90% of the stuff that I show there is defined by the JPA spec. Greetings from Slovenia, from Yanei. Is it possible to use both Spring Data JPA and Spring Data JDBC in one project? I think it is, but that's clearly a question for you, Jens.
Yes, absolutely. That should work right out of the box without any problems. And actually, I've never tried it because I almost exclusively develop Spring Data and only get a glimpse into the user side of things through questions asked. But that's actually one thing I'd like to see, and which might be a good idea if you want to modularize a JPA application with all the relationships like totally entangled, like the person just wrote in the comments. It might be an interesting idea to move one aggregate at a time to Spring Data JDBC, and thereby getting some basically enforced modularity into the domain model. So yeah, that should work.
Okay.
What is the time? Our local time? Close to 4 p.m. So Central European time.
Joint is more efficient in terms of cardinality as an inheritance strategy. Yeah, it can be. It totally depends on the the kind of data that you're storing. So in my experience, it's almost impossible to give a good good answer to an inheritance mapping question without taking a look at the data that you're actually storing in the database. And I'm not talking about the table model. I really want to see a representative data set of the stuff that you're working with in production. Okay. I want to prevent race conditions when updating an entity.
I think that refers back to the isolation level question.
Yeah.
And the normal race conditions are perfectly taken care of by the standard optimistic locking, which basically means adding a version attribute to an entity, and then JPA or Spring Data JDBC will check that the version didn't change from the time when you loaded it until the time that you're trying to persist it. With JPA, there's one thing you have to take or to think about is if you have a collection in your entity. Again, consider you have an order with order items. By default, JPA, Tom will correct me if I'm wrong, will consider only the version of a single entity. So you will be able to persist the order, although maybe somebody has added an order item or changed one of the order items, which might actually, or in the case of an order, might actually be a case of a race condition. Imagine something, you have one process calculating the final price, another process adds an item, and if those two get mixed up, bad things might happen. But there's a configuration to prevent that, and in Spring Data JDBC, this basically can't happen in the first place because, surprise, you have aggregates. And you have just a version on the aggregate root, and everything gets checked against that. So aggregates will be always consistent.
Yeah, you can achieve something similar with JPA. So in the default configuration, you're completely right. It's just on each record. But you have a feature called optimistic force increment, and you can use that to increment the version on a record that you select with the query. So if you're working on an order position, you would then do a select on the corresponding order with this optimistic force increment, and that would increment the version number on that order. And that would then give you the chance to detect these concurrent modifications. But yeah, if you don't do that, if you just rely on Hibernate's default handling, which you would normally do because it works in all other situations, then you can't detect these things. It's just caused by the situation that you are preventing the concurrent modifications by managing a version number on each record. Yeah, hi Ganesh. Steve says, this has been great, guys. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, thanks for joining, Jens. Really enjoyed it so far. It was a lot of fun.
It's a pleasure. Otherwise, I'm sitting alone in my office. This is way more fun.
Oh, that's good. Priyak said, thanks for that. My question was actually about this property current session context class thread. I would need to double check that configuration option.
Oh, I think that is okay. I probably should the documentation as well, but I think it's the configuration when a new session is started and how long it does live. And this setting, which looks like the default setting, would then be that the session is bound to a thread, which if you're in a servlet container is basically one request. So this is the right thing to do in like 99.9 of all cases. If you want anything different, you would need a good reason why. I mean,
Yeah.
there are obviously reasons to do that other things, but I don't think I can come up with something from top of my head right now.
No, me neither. I know that I saw different approaches in a few projects, but based on the experience there, I would highly recommend to not change it from the default because it always was an issue in these projects. Handling that is more difficult than it might seem. Okay, it looks like I pronounced Jenny's name correctly. That's good. Yeah, Adam says thanks. Oh yeah, we talked about the my Bartis thing. Okay, then final question by Gonzalo, and then we wrap it up. Hello, what strategy do you recommend to have data fields in multiple languages in a database? What is efficient if you need to query that data using HQL criteria? Well, that totally depends on the flexibility that you need and the number of different languages you need to support. So there are two approaches that I saw in real projects so far. A very basic one where they just supported, I don't know, 2 or 3 languages for just a few columns, and then they just had multiple of these columns on each database table and corresponding attributes on the entity. So there was a description underscore en and a description underscore de. And well, if you have a small number of columns and languages you need to support, then this works pretty fine because it's simple and the queries are efficient. But adding an additional language is a really bad idea because you need to update everything. So yeah, I would be careful with using that approach. And the other approach would be to have a translation table where you basically just have keys that you then look up in that table. So if you have a purchase order entity, for example, and there you have a description field, then you would have a translation table in which you then have probably a column in which you store, okay, this is for purchase order, and then another column for the ID of that object for which you store the translation, and then the language, and then the field, and then you always need to query that table to get the translations for that specific language, which can become a performance issue because you either need to perform a relatively high amount of queries, a high number of queries, or you have lots of joins on that table. Both of that can be an issue. Yeah, there's no really a great solution for that, I would say. If you want a really extendable system and you need to translate a lot of messages and maybe even your users provide the different translations, then you need this additional translation table. And there you need to pay special attention to indices and making sure that the queries are efficient.
Yeah. One thing I'd also would try to challenge is, do you really need to use it in HQL / criteria API directly? One thing that I had good experience with is actually loading all translations into memory, because, like, I mean, obviously it depends on your application, but in that application there was like one process, people translating stuff, but for like, I don't know, 98% of the users' translations were a fixed resource. So we could load it up into memory and then reference it from there. Basically a big hash map. And also, if you're searching in translated text, you're basically normally doing text search, and it might be a good idea to look into dedicated solutions for that.
Yeah.
That also can do like close matches that also find the right text if there's a minor typo in it or an additional S or something.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. Okay, Luis Alberto also asked about passing an array parameter to a PostgreSQL function in JPA. There
I think
is, yeah,
you can define like a custom type for that, right?
yeah,
Isn't there an article by Vladimir Kea about
yeah.
that?
You would need to define a custom type for that. There is, I think, no out-of-the-box support for that. Okay.
It works out of the box in Spring Data JDBC, by the way. A list or array of strings or ints or primitives will get persisted as an array
Yeah.
if the database supports it, which basically is, I think, only Postgres, the officially supported databases.
Yeah.
Now Gonzalez mentions he's considering JSON objects for translated columns. Yeah, sounds
Yeah.
possible to me.
Yeah, maybe. The downside is you always load all the translations. I mean, you can't fetch a part of the JSON document. And then, well, that can be okay, but it can also be an issue depending on the number of translations that you store in the JSON document. But yeah, can be an option. Okay. Has been a long stream. Jens, thanks a lot
Right.
for joining. It was really a lot of fun, and we got tons of questions. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for joining.
Me too.
I hope the coronavirus situation improves and we soon meet at another conference.
Yeah, I'm afraid that will take some while.
Yeah, probably end of the year, beginning of next year. But yeah, I hope to meet you in person soon. Thanks for your time, and well, maybe I can invite you again at some point. So
Yeah, sure, anytime. And I probably hang around in the comments again on the upcoming streams.
oh, that's great. Thanks for that. So you need to remember to turn off the app that currently blocks you from YouTube, right?
Yeah, limited to a couple of hours until short before 3.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for joining, everyone. I will be back tomorrow with another stream, and tomorrow Oliver Drotbaum, also from Pivotal, from the Spring team, will join me, and we will talk about domain-driven design, JPA, Spring Data JPA. He had a few interesting ideas there that he published in a blog post, and we will talk about that. So see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.